May 20, 1940. A small French farmhouse sits silently amidst a field of tall, wet grass near the Channel coast, the morning mist still clinging to the low, red-tiled roof. The silence is shattered not by the distant thunder of artillery, but by the roar of powerful engines. 3 Panzer III tanks, their tracks chewing up the muddy track, emerge from the tree line. Atop the lead vehicle, Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, adjusts his binoculars, his face set in a grim, almost disbelieving expression of success. It has been just 11 days since Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, was launched. Not weeks, not months, but 11 days. The entire Allied strategy, based on a repeat of the static trench warfare of the Great War and a robust defensive line anchored on the Belgian frontier, has been rendered obsolete by the speed and audacity of Guderian's armored spearhead. The bulk of the French and British forces, precisely where the Allies expected the main thrust, are trapped far to the north, cut off by the drive to the sea. The swift coordinated advance of the Panzer divisions through the impassable Ardennes forest, a movement dismissed by Allied command as impossible for heavy armor, has bypassed the formidable Maginot Line entirely. The air above them is owned by the Luftwaffe. A flight of screaming Junkers, Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, circles high overhead, their fixed undercarriage giving them a menacing, predatory silhouette. Their signature Jericho trumpet sirens, a psychological weapon as potent as their bombs, herald the complete collapse of French command and control. Wherever the panzers encounter resistance, whether from desperate French infantry or stalled British expeditionary forces, the Stukas eliminate the strong points before the tanks even have to slow down. It's a flawless, deadly ballet of combined arms warfare, tanks, motorized infantry, and close air support acting as a single unstoppable force. Back in his forward headquarters, surrounded by maps meticulously detailing the enemy's panicked retreat, Adolf Hitler permits himself a rare, triumphant smile. The generals who had cautioned him, who had warned that the audacious Manstein plan was too risky, too dependent on luck and speed, now stand silently, awed. France, the military power that had held the German Empire at bay for 4 brutal years, just 2 decades prior, is disintegrating. Hitler had overruled his general staff, the supposed experts, and his intuition, his genius, had been vindicated. He sees this triumph not merely as a military victory, but as a personal validation of his strategic brilliance, a confirmation of destiny. The French army, supposedly the finest in Europe, has been defeated not by superior numbers, but by superior will and method. The campaign would wrap up officially in just over 6 weeks with the signing of the armistice at Compiègne. The sheer ease of the conquest creates a catastrophic perception that the modern German military, the Wehrmacht, is invincible, and that Western civilization's democracies are fundamentally weak, their defenses nothing more than a rotten structure, waiting for a good kick. This perception, born of the fields of France, will fatally warp his strategic thinking for the next great venture, the colossal undertaking he had always intended, the destruction of Bolshevism and the conquest of Lebensraum in the East. The intoxicating scent of victory, the sight of his elite panzers rolling unchallenged toward Paris, convinced him that all barriers, regardless of size, would crumble just as easily. The sheer geographical expanse of Russia, the boundless manpower of the Soviet Union, the logistical nightmare of its non-existent road network, all these warnings from his staff were now dismissed as the pessimistic chatter of conventional minds. They hadn't believed in the Blitzkrieg either. He had delivered France in 6 weeks. He would deliver Russia in 6 months, or less. June 22, 1940. Just miles from the captured French capital, a low-slung, heavily camouflaged staff car snakes its way through a dense forest, carrying General Franz Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff. He clutches a thick, leather-bound folder containing preliminary assessments of the next target, the Soviet Union. Despite the overwhelming euphoria gripping the Wehrmacht following the French collapse, a chilling certainty permeates the minds of the senior general staff. Russia is not France. Halder's detailed reports outlined a host of fundamental differences that Hitler, basking in the glow of his personal victory, was utterly unwilling to acknowledge. Firstly, geography was the enemy. France was a compact, densely populated country with excellent rail and road networks, ideal for the fast, decisive armored thrusts of the Blitzkrieg. The Soviet Union, in contrast, was a sprawling colossus, spanning 11 time zones with vast tracts of wilderness, deep forests, and poorly maintained, unpaved roads. The notorious rasputitsa, or season of mud, promised to paralyze any motorized force. Secondly, the sheer scale of resistance was misunderstood. While the German intelligence apparatus grossly underestimated the numerical strength of the Red Army, they did point out that, unlike the French, the Soviets were fighting for their very existence, defending a totalitarian ideology and their homeland, instilled with a ruthless resilience drilled by Joseph Stalin. They possessed an almost limitless supply of manpower to throw into the meat grinder. The French, for all their bravery, lacked this depth of reserve and national will in the face of rapid, existential defeat. Crucially, logistics presented a problem of a scale never before contemplated. The advance into the Soviet Union would stretch the German supply lines hundreds, then thousands of miles eastward, far exceeding the range of conventional motor transport. The Soviets also employed a different railway gauge $1 524\text mm than the standard European gauge $1 for 35\text mm. This seemingly technical detail meant that every single mile of captured railway line had to be painstakingly regauged by dedicated engineering detachments before German locomotives could use them, a monumental, time-consuming effort that would inevitably lag behind the fast-moving panzer groups. Halder himself expressed these concerns to his aides. "We can move tanks fast, but we cannot move fuel, ammunition, and rations fast enough across 1,000 miles of hostile swamp and tundra." The plan, already codenamed Operation Otto and later Barbarossa, required the German armies to reach a line stretching from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan, the AA line, before the onset of the brutal Russian winter. Hitler, however, dismissed these professional warnings as nothing more than the excessive caution of the old school. "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down," Hitler famously declared, convinced that the Stalinist purges had decapitated the Red Army's officer corps, leaving it a hollow shell. He viewed the Soviet regime as politically unstable and believed that upon the first major defeat, the Slavic masses would rise up against their Bolshevik masters. The success in France had inflated his ego to the point of strategic blindness. He was now convinced he possessed a unique, infallible insight into the decay of all opposing states, military and political. He pushed his generals for an impossible timeline: the defeat of the Soviet Union in 8 to 10 weeks, a time frame that allowed zero margin for error, logistical failure, or a robust, coordinated Soviet defense. This supreme confidence, rooted in the swift triumph over France, became the fatal flaw that would define the entire Eastern campaign. June 22nd, Eastern Poland. The quiet of the pre-dawn Soviet border is shattered by the deafening concussion of Operation Barbarossa. Over 3.8 million Axis soldiers, supported by 3,400 tanks and 7,200 pieces of artillery, unleash the most massive land invasion in human history. The opening artillery barrages are devastatingly accurate, slamming into forward Soviet airfields, barracks, and command posts, designed to replicate the shock and speed that paralyzed the French. In the skies above, the Luftwaffe delivers a crushing, preemptive blow. Hundreds of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters tear apart the Soviet Air Force on the ground, burning thousands of aircraft before they can even take off. This initial air superiority mirrors the Western campaign and allows the massive three army groups, North, Center, and South, to punch deep into Soviet territory with astonishing speed. General Heinz Guderian, now commanding the 2nd Panzer Group under Army Group Center, spearheads the drive towards Moscow. His panzer divisions, veterans of the French campaign, move with brutal efficiency. The initial results are stunning, seemingly validating Hitler's hubristic predictions. Soviet defenses, caught completely by surprise and hampered by Stalin's rigid, centralized command structure, crumble almost instantly. The German armored columns exploit the gaps, driving deep past the front lines to execute massive encirclement battles, Kesselschlachten. Near Minsk, the panzers execute a colossal double envelopment, trapping over 300,000 Red Army soldiers. A few weeks later, at Smolensk, another massive pocket yields 180,000 prisoners. The images beamed back to Berlin are intoxicating. Endless columns of disheveled, defeated Soviet prisoners marching west, and the charred wreckage of Soviet tanks, including the surprisingly formidable KV-1 and T-34 models, which were previously unknown to German intelligence. These early victories reinforce Hitler's belief that the rotten structure is indeed collapsing. He sees the staggering prisoner count not as a sign of desperate Soviet resilience and the sheer size of their army, but as evidence of their political and military weakness. However, the reality on the ground begins to diverge sharply from the French model. While the French often surrendered once their command structure was broken, the Soviet soldiers, even when surrounded and facing certain doom, often fought with a fanatical determination the Wehrmacht had never encountered. Isolated groups continued to resist, slowing down the mechanized infantry units tasked with clearing the pockets. Crucially, the Russian roads, or lack thereof, began to exact their toll. German supply trucks, designed for European asphalt, constantly broke down on the muddy tracks, and the forward speed of the panzers soon outstripped the ability of the logistics tail to keep them supplied with fuel, spare parts, and ammunition. Even worse, the sheer distance was debilitating. The distance from the German starting point to Moscow was over 800 kilometers, $497 miles. By August, Guderian's tanks, though still advancing, were exhibiting severe mechanical wear, and the frontline soldiers were physically exhausted. The short, sharp campaign anticipated by Hitler was already stretching into a grueling, attritional conflict. The logistical planning, tailored for a quick victory, was proving hopelessly inadequate for the reality of conquering a nation spanning a sixth of the world's landmass. The mirage of the early Blitzkrieg success, blinding Hitler, was rapidly melting away under the vast Russian sun and the grinding resistance of the Red Army. August 1941. The vast logistical strain and the ferocious, if uncoordinated, Soviet resistance should have prompted a strategic review. The German Wehrmacht was deep inside the Soviet Union, but Army Group Center, the designated spearhead for Moscow, was slowing dramatically. General Fedot von Bock, commanding the group, and his armored commanders Guderian and Halder, desperately argued for a straight, decisive thrust toward the Soviet capital, believing its capture was the key to paralyzing the Soviet state before winter. This was the moment when Hitler's supreme overconfidence, cultivated by the easy victory over France, fatally intervened. He disregarded the pleas of his top generals, convinced that the war was already won and that the capture of the capital was merely a secondary objective. He saw greater value in seizing the economic resources of the South and the crucial supply port of Leningrad in the north. His strategic shift was based on resource acquisition, not the decisive destruction of the enemy's main fighting force, a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the war. In a move that infuriated his field commanders, Hitler ordered a massive northward pivot of Guderian's and Halder's panzer groups from the approaches to Moscow. Their mission: assist Army Group South in trapping vast Soviet forces around Kiev, and also shore up the drive towards Leningrad. The resulting Battle of Kiev was another colossal Kesselschlacht, yielding an unprecedented 665,000 Soviet prisoners in September. On paper, it was the greatest victory in military history. Yet, this colossal victory was strategically devastating. The forces diverted south, critical panzer divisions, motorized infantry, and their precious fuel reserves, lost vital time traversing hundreds of miles of muddy, substandard roads. While the German armies celebrated the fall of Kiev, they were sacrificing the narrow window of good weather necessary to capture Moscow. The month-long diversion meant that when the panzers were finally permitted to turn back toward Moscow for Operation Typhoon in October, the rasputitsa, the autumn rains that turned the entire Russian landscape into a quagmire of impassable mud, had begun. Colonel General Guderian, already facing deep operational friction with the high command, noted the catastrophic effect on his troops and equipment. The rapid wear and tear on the tanks and vehicles meant that their operational readiness rate plummeted. Many vehicles were now immobile, awaiting spare parts that were delayed by the strained logistics. The roads that had once allowed the seamless sweep through France now trapped the Wehrmacht in thick, sucking mud up to the axles. The speed that defined Blitzkrieg was gone, replaced by a brutal, agonizing crawl. The fundamental strategic assumption that the Soviet regime would collapse after a few sharp blows, just like France, had proven utterly wrong. Instead of a fragile structure, the Germans found a nation willing to trade space for time, absorbing blows and mobilizing vast reserves from the Urals and Siberia. The delay for Kiev, a direct result of Hitler's confidence in his own superior non-military judgment, had cost the Wehrmacht the weather, the initiative, and ultimately, the chance to achieve its immediate goal of taking Moscow before the onset of the brutal, freezing winter. November 1941. The final, desperate drive toward Moscow, Operation Typhoon, has stalled. The rasputitsa has transitioned from paralyzing mud to the first, biting frosts, which briefly hardened the ground and allowed the German forces a brief, final surge. The leading elements of Army Group Center could now see the church spires of Moscow on the horizon, some advanced reconnaissance units reportedly getting within 30 kilometers, $19 miles, of the capital. It was agonizingly close, a physical testament to the immense distances they had overcome and the victories they had achieved. But the price of proximity was crippling. The German soldiers, still clad in inadequate non-winter uniforms, because the logistics planners, based on Hitler's 8 to 10-week victory timeline, had deemed heavy winter gear unnecessary, were now facing temperatures plummeting far below freezing, sometimes reaching $:circ/text $:22 $:circ/text $. Hands froze to metal, lubricants solidified, and thousands of men suffered severe frostbite, diminishing combat effectiveness by the hour. The sophisticated machinery of the Blitzkrieg was failing in the extreme cold. The high-octane aviation fuel used by the Luftwaffe was struggling to ignite in the cold, drastically reducing air support. More critically, the sophisticated mechanisms of the German Panzer engines and transmissions, designed with tight tolerances, seized up in the intense cold. German tank crews had to start fires beneath their engines for hours just to get them running, a logistical and tactical nightmare. Meanwhile, the Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks, designed with wider operating clearances and simple diesel engines, handled the cold far better, maintaining a crucial operational advantage. On December 5th, the Soviets launched their massive, long-prepared counteroffensive. General Georgy Zhukov unleashed fresh, well-equipped Siberian divisions, troops specifically trained and geared for winter warfare, who had been held back while Hitler was busy with his southern diversions. These troops, skiing across the snow-covered terrain and supported by specialized winter equipment, slammed into the exhausted, frozen, and demoralized German formations. The German army, which had expected to be billeted in Moscow luxury by this point, now faced a desperate fight for survival, hunkered down in hastily dug, frozen trenches thousands of miles from Germany. Hitler's conviction that the Soviet Union would collapse as easily as France had led to a fundamental failure to prepare for a long war, for Russian geography, and for the Russian winter. He had taken the blueprint for conquering a geographically small, densely populated Western European democracy and fatally applied it to a massive, resilient totalitarian state on the Eurasian steppe. The strategic genius he believed he possessed, validated by the success of Fall Gelb, had lured him into a disastrous strategic blunder on the Eastern Front, ending the myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility and marking the true turning point of the war. His hubris, born of 6 weeks of triumph, was now entombed in the endless snows around Moscow.